Hey everyone, I'm Chris Carter here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We today are going to talk about the big news. Mike Tomlin is staying with the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're not moving on from him. What are the Rooney's plans for the team moving forward? What are the other coaching changes that need to be made if Mike Tomlin is not going? And what philosophical team changes are needed? All here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show in your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. You can get a big return now with FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed win or lose with your first bet of $5 or more. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, Steelers fans, let's get into it. We got to talk about the big news of the day. And as we said, there was going to be a decision probably announced or said soon. It is reported not just from one source, but from many people. Jerry Dulac, one of my colleagues at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who when he says something, he has a good line on it, but it's backed up by Adam Schefter, several people nationally. The Steelers are planning to keep Mike Tomlin, not moving on from him. They don't have plans to move him anywhere or to fire him of any sort. Now, as we said, there were three ways that if the Steelers were going to move on from Tomlin, that it could happen. One was firing, which we said was very highly unlikely because they just signed him to a 3-year extension for big money, and the Rooneys aren't just going to cut him and then owe him a whole bunch of money. That's not going to happen. The other way was if there was going to be traded, but there's no trade clause in Mike Tomlin's contract, which means he alone gets to say if he wants to go somewhere else or not. And it appears that's not the case. And then there's, of course, the choice that he could choose to either retire or say, I'm stepping away from football for a year or two and do like a Sean Payton move and just wind up somewhere else. All those things were the possibilities. We now know that the firing isn't going to happen. Now, I will say I would give it a 5% chance, like a very outside shot, that the Steelers are saying, hey, we're not going, we're keeping Mike Tomlin. Our plan's not to move him. And then someone calls in and they say that because that's their stance. They don't plan on moving on from it. That's their stance going into a trade. And that drives up the trade market for him. And maybe they make a move there. But again, I don't think that's what the Steelers are doing. I think that they're absolutely sticking with him. This is what the Steelers have always been as far as their coaches. I see a hard time for them changing from that. Now, the question is, though, what is the plan if you're not moving on from him? Because clearly you do need changes. And again, I think that there's some of the other things that you could look at in the past years and say, well, hey, that's not on this coach and that's not on that coach. But then when you look at the way that this season ended, it would have been fine if they had lost to the Ravens in a tight contest where they just edged them out, a la old school Steelers Ravens fashion, as it had looked like in several games in this rivalry over the past several years. But that's not what happened in this playoff game. They were bludgeoned 21-0 and going into the half. They were able to get 2 scores and outscore the Ravens in the second half, but they never got the game inside of 14 points. And that's not the way that you wanted to go out on the season. They looked defeated and crushed. And so you look and say, hey, when the team looks this rough, you got to look around and you got to say what needs to change. And of course, the first thing comes up is the head coach. And if the Steelers aren't moving on from the head coach, how can they institute better change there? Now, we do know these things to be true, and we'll talk about more of those coaching changes that are coming up. Teryl Austin, I believe his contract is up this year, and there's questions about other position coaches. But I do think that the Rooneys are sticking to the idea that the Steelers are still in the rebuild of a process to get their team to become the kind of team that they said they wanted to be. They want to be a physical team, and they weren't a physical team. They got dominated in the trenches. The Ravens had like 300 yards on the ground. The Steelers had like 20, and that was just the complete opposite of what you wanted to be in the big games. You were building that to be so much better. So if you look at that and you look at what the Steelers, hadn't done this year, you say like, man, that's not it. But we also know, as we said, going into this year, this was the early stages, especially on the offensive line of the side of the ball. We'll get to the defense in a bit because I want to talk about that with coaching changes. But when you look at the offensive side of the ball and you look at what they were supposed to do in the trenches, the run game disappeared this year, which is crazy because last year the run game it appeared in the second half of the season. They were able to pick things up. They were able to get things going. This year, the run game was working at one point in the season, in the middle to going into the, throughout the third quarter of the season. When you got to that fourth quarter of the season, it just flat out died. And I think that a lot of that came down to teams kind of picked up on what Russell Wilson was doing a little bit. I think teams also just saw that the Steelers offensive line wasn't blocking well, particularly the entire left side of the offensive line. Dan Moore and Isaac Seumalo had really rough stretches. Broderick Jones wasn't that great at times. I did think he had better days, throughout the season, and he was able to go up and down, as did Mason McCormick. I thought the one constant on the Steelers offensive line was Zach Frazier. But again, you can't make a good offensive line with just one player being consistent. You need everybody to be consistent. And that's the problem here, is that the Steelers offensive line never developed this year the way that you were hoping it would. And granted, you can say, hey, the veteran who was playing the best, early in the season, James Daniels, went down early in the season, and that ended his time in Pittsburgh. And as we've talked about Alan Saunders and several other people, there's apparently it's been kind of like already agreed upon he's not coming back for the Steelers next year in free agency, though maybe they should look at him with the way Isaac Seumalo is playing. And then there's, of course, Dan Moore Jr., who was supposed to not be starting for the Steelers offensive line because Troy Fautanu was going to come in and, either he or Broderick Jones is going to be at left tackle, the other one would be at right tackle, and the new future of the Steelers offensive line would be assembled and, get its chance to kind of learn together and grow throughout the year. Well, that didn't happen, and this offensive line didn't grow, and so the physicality of this team didn't grow. The version of this team that they were hoping would come to fruition never became. And so that's where you have to look at is, can you become that team? And I think that what the Steelers are looking at with Andy Weidel, who's Omar Khan's right-hand man, and Omar Khan himself, they're trying to give themselves time to rebuild and to become that team. And it takes time. It took Andy Weidel to make the Eagles who they are, the way they are right now. And the Eagles, go look at what the Eagles are doing and how they won. A lot of people say you can't win with that style of football. They just did in the playoffs. And I thought the Packers were a good team. They took them out. But I think that that's where the Steelers are at right now, is at that point where this was the second year of working with this new GM office, and as far as rebuilding the team, trying to send it in the direction that you wanted to be there. This is very similar to when Bill Cowher had to let Kevin Colbert come in, and he had to get things reworking. And so you had to give time for it to rebuild, time for it to grow. And eventually Kevin Colbert hit several times early in the draft, was able to get guys like Polamalu, Casey Hampton, add guys in free agents like James Ferrier, and eventually drafted a guy named Ben Roethlisberger. And they were able to assemble a really good team that won them a Super Bowl. And I'm not saying that that's what this front office is doing right now, but that's what you're trying to give them the space to do. So if you're looking at the front office, you're saying, okay, keep doing what you're doing, keep building up the trenches, keep adding skilled players where you can, and we'll go from there. And eventually they are going to need to make a big investment to try to figure out what they're doing at quarterback. And trust me, we will get to the quarterback question eventually. But I wanted to spend today talking about the coaching stuff, considering the news. But looking at how the Steelers are handling this, I think that the Steelers are saying, hey, they want to keep going in that direction. The question is Mike Tomlin the best guy to take them in that direction? Is he still the coach that you want at the top of it while they're fixing all these things underneath it? I want to talk more about that and the other coaches that may be changing if Mike Tomlin isn't. We'll do that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, remind you, this show is also brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the place that you go to find help for your small business. And growing small businesses in 2025 comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. That's where LinkedIn comes in, because with stronger hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence you make the best decisions for your business. I've used LinkedIn Jobs myself, and I can tell you it's a game changer when it comes to hiring the right fit. Small businesses are wearing a lot of hats, so every hire is crucial. LinkedIn gets that. That's why they connect you with the best candidates using data you won't find anywhere else. From unique skills and interests to the connections you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of all small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high-quality candidates. I know from experience, when building your business, you need the right teammates who won't drop the ball on you. LinkedIn helps you look over the best candidates available to find that trustworthy playmaker for your business. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. We're also brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most out of the final weeks of football action. That's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash and daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex player to boost your payout, you want to get cash quickly, you can do that with Prize Picks because they got you covered. Over 10 million members and billions in winnings. It's clear that people are loving this platform, and when your picks hit, Prize Picks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. Here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today. Use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play just $5. You play your first $5 lineup. That's Prize Picks. Run your game. Again, download the Prize Picks app today. Use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly when you play just $5. Prize Picks. Run your game. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here today about the Pittsburgh Steelers and what their coaching decisions are moving forward. Now, again, we said that there would be a quick decision made on the Mike Tomlin situation, particularly because all the other NFL teams that are in the market for head coaches, they're wondering right now. And so this is the hot time if you're going to make the move that you would do so. Again, there's still a very, very outside chance that the Steelers are saying this now just to kind of boost up the price on Mike Tomlin if they want to move him. That'd be an interesting, sneaky move by the Steelers if they did that. But I think that's a very unlikely move. It's just not the way the Steelers have operated. Granted, who knows? Maybe that's what they need to do is change things up. But I want to talk about what they need to do if they're not moving on from Mike Tomlin, because let's be realistic. That's probably what's happening here. So if they're not moving on from Mike Tomlin, what changes can you make? And I think that there's a few things that they need to look at as far as moving forward. And it comes down to the physicality of this team and the way that they want to play. We'll get to the offense in a sec because I know we want to talk about Pat Meyer, but I want to talk about Teryl Austin. Now, if you look at Teryl Austin and what his tenure has been with the Pittsburgh Steelers, he came in, remember, as their DB's coach. He was able to come in and help in the back end of the secondary when Keith Butler was there. He came in 2019, and when he came in, the Steelers secondary was on fire. That's when they traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick. They had Steven Nelson, they had Joe Hayden, they had Terrell Edmonds. They played lights out for his first 2 years, and really first 3 years as a secondary coach for the Steelers. They were flying all over the place. They were intercepting passes. They were a big reason why the Steelers were competitive in all three of those seasons. Again, 2019, 8-8 with Devlin Hodges. 2020, they get to 12 wins and lose in the first round of the playoffs. 2021, they find a way to scrap their way with old man Ben Roethlisberger into the playoffs there. And then he becomes defensive coordinator in 2022. The Steelers defense does rank among the best in the NFL in his 3 years, but ultimately doesn't become a much better unit. It doesn't recapture the elite element that it had in the 2019 season, where in 2020 season, I think those are like the two top 5 years that you look at how they performed there, where the defense really carried the team through some really tough stretches of offense at different times. And I think what you look at here is what Teryl Austin, I think, brought to the table was when you look back at Keith Butler and what he did as a defensive coordinator, much of what made Keith Butler's defenses work when they did work was how they blitzed, with how they attacked. It was what they did up front, and the secondary was often very bland. It wasn't as intricate. And part of it was also the personnel. They couldn't be as intricate because they had, Artie Burns and Ross Cockrell. Ross Cockrell wasn't that bad, but Cody Sensabaugh, Antoine Blake, those crews of guys. They didn't have the guys to run the Sean Davis, not the guys that were going to be game changers in the back end who could run intricate schemes. And then you added Minkah Fitzpatrick and Joe Hayden and those guys, and then it got a little more intricate with him back there. So you're hoping, okay, with Teryl Austin being promoted as defensive coordinator, maybe you'll get those as a more regular thing. Well, I think we saw in 2022 and 2023 a little bit of that, but I think you also saw as that happened, the defensive front of the Steelers, I think, was kind of left to kind of win on its own, and that's fine if that's part of your strategy, and it did work for quite some time as far as asking them to win with 4-man rushes and pull that off. But I think eventually it didn't develop much else. And I think that whereas Teryl Austin, a lot of people ask me this question, well, Chris, aren't they winning with their talent, not their scheme? I always think that's a misguided question, because you scheme to win with talent. That's how that works. Like you say, hey, we have these advantages on our defense. Let's use them this way. Now, again, we pointed out times where I think that there could have been switches up in that scheme to use them in different ways. And that's what ultimately the coordinators, the position coach, and the head coach all come down to. I said way back in, what was it, week 8 or so, that the Steelers should try to move TJ Watt around more, because the teams were clearly just isolating him and saying, hey, let's get 2 hats on him right now. And that was a big part of this Ravens game. There's people putting out there like, oh, TJ Watt didn't have a single stat in this game and he was terrible and he was being single blocked by Rosengarten all night. And then someone pointed out there were only two true pass reps where Rosengarten was one-on-one and he got clean beat by TJ Watt on that. Every other time there was a tight end, a running back, a tight end, and a running back, a second offensive lineman putting their hat on TJ Watt with Rosengarten. It was part of their plan. And also they were putting him in spots where Rosengarten didn't have to do too much because they were kind of running away from him or just jumping outside of him. And Rosengarten's job wasn't to necessarily try to pancake TJ Watt. It was to jump outside of him and say, hey, you're going to have to run me over to get out wide on this play. So they did things like that to isolate him. And I think that's where you needed to move TJ Watt around more this year. Something we said that they should have been doing. We broke down for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in a film study back against the Giants why I think it was helping. And they did it for 4 times in that game. And then it didn't really come back at all this year. And I think that's something that they need to explore, is if the Steelers are going to do something on defense, they need to get a defensive coordinator that's going to use their star players. I still think him and Alex Highsmith and Cam Hayward are all very good players, but maybe they need to be switched up a little bit more. Maybe there's different things that you can do, machinations that you could get those guys going in different spots, make it tougher for offenses to predict where they're going to line up, how you can block them and what their sets are. Because again, the whole point of a defense, the whole point of schemes is you want to force your opponent to have to ask more questions throughout the game and to not be as certain about what you're doing. And so that they have to be thinking and not be certain about what they're doing. When you're doing that, you get them into making mistakes. And frankly, the Steelers defense didn't do that for the last part of the season. I thought there were times against the Bengals in that last loss that they had where it looked like they were getting it back. We talked about how the Steelers needed to bring heat. They needed to send everything after Lamar Jackson, because if you looked at how how the defense had played with sending the blitz throughout the year, I said, when Patrick Queen rushed the quarterback at least 6 times in a game, they were 5-1. He rushed 5 times, so marginally they did it a little bit, but still wasn't enough to stop Lamar Jackson. But I think that's the whole thing, is that defensive front wasn't intricate enough, and that's where you got to go. I think if you're the Steelers defense, you need a coordinator who either is going to be able to specialize in things up front, or can specialize in putting the whole piece together. Because we talked about a lot this season was, hey, the defensive front, you got confidence that they got talent up there. TJ Watt, Highsmith, Hayward, Benton's developing. Eric Ogunjobi, I think, might be one of the free agent cap casualties, but again, we'll get to that at some point. You got better linebacker play from Patrick Queen. Still not great, but better linebacker play from Patrick Queen. Landon Roberts is always a steady rocket, run stopping, and Peyton Wilson I thought was a good addition this year. And who knows, maybe you get Cole Holcomb back next year with his whole injury situation. And then in the secondary, you did have some shakiness there. Dante Jackson I thought was solid for the most part of the year. Definitely got injured late, and that impacted him. But getting 5 interceptions was helpful. Joey Porter Jr. I thought was up and down at times, but I think he was more up than down throughout the season. I thought Deshaun Elliott was a heck of an addition to the secondary, maybe even the best player in the secondary for most of the year. And then Minka Fitzpatrick, I think he had a lot of moments where he was kind of not doing as much, on the stat sheet, but he was doing a lot to cover certain parts of the field and wasn't getting targeted. But as the season went on, you were hoping that you could get more from him. And I think especially in that Ravens game, there were several times where he was coming from deep and just in a weird position where he wasn't able to help against Lamar Jackson in the option run because he was coming from so far deep when you looked at the tape. And there were certain parts where, hey, when Derrick Henry got to that third level of the defense where he's now getting stiff armed because he's that far out. So I think that there could have been better usage of those guys as well. And I think that's where you have to look at Teryl Austin. You think, man, what needs to be better there? And then if Teryl Austin moves on, who do you get to replace him. Now, typically the Steelers, they like to hire from within, and I know that's probably going to tick people off because they want to see change. They want to see something different. And frankly, when you look at the way the defense played in this game and the lack of physicality at the point of attack, how they got beat and just run over by the Ravens, you want to do change there. You want to see a different philosophy. And I don't think that means gutting the whole defensive staff, because I do think there's some really good coaches. I think Denzel Martin's done a heck of a job with those outside linebackers, TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Nick Herbig. He's done a fantastic job. I think Carl Dunbar has done a solid job helping develop guys like Keanu Benton. I think Grady Brown is doing a good job helping the young secondary learn their game. So maybe not like a full retooling, but maybe getting a new person to kind of oversee it all and say, hey, we're going to put a whole game plan together where it's not just the front blitzing in all these different ways and not just the secondary behind them trying to be complex in their coverages. Let's put them all together. And I think that's what the Steelers have to look at. And yes, Mike Tomlin is the guy. He's the one that kind of, he wants the defensive philosophy to kind of mold around what he's been about. And I think that's fine, but you still need a coordinator who's going to be the person that says, hey, we're going to piece this all together. Because Mike Tomlin, while he is overseeing the defense and he's more of a defensive coach, he's also putting his head in the offensive room. He's also putting his head in special teams. He's putting it, as you saw in the Hard Knocks, he meets with like every person on the team, every coach. And so that's where you need your defensive coordinator and your defensive coaches to be able to say, hey, all right, here's this game plan. We're going to try to put things together, be more chaotic, or organized chaos, bringing organized chaos to the Steelers defense. I don't think they didn't do that enough this season. Again, when they brought heat with Patrick Queen, which he's a down blitzing linebacker, he does that really well a lot. The Steelers won most of their games when they did that more. I think that's something that they could try to open up more, and maybe they need a defensive coach who can be mindful of how to use the front in different ways, but also be mindful of how to use the back end of the defense in different ways. And I think that's one of the big changes that we needed. But also, I think that they need to be looking on the other side of the ball at specifically the group that was supposed to take a step up this year, but didn't: offensive line. We'll talk about that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast and what changes are coming with that. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I remind you, this show is also brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed win or lose with your first bet of $5 or more. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. The wild card round of the NFL wraps up tonight with the Vikings as 2.5-point road favorites over the Rams. Next week, the Chiefs are already 7.5-point favorites over the Texans. The Lions are 8.5-point favorites over the Commanders, and the Bills are 1.5-point favorites over the Ravens. We'll see who the Eagles have to play in the winner of the Rams and the Vikings. Where will you put your money? You can do so at FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. You can start the season with a big return. FanDuel.com today. Join there today, and you can grab $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed with your first bet of $5 or more. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when your first bet of $5 only on FanDuel.com. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue talking about this show. Now, I think that part of this, the challenges that the Steelers are facing right now, is they need something to develop. I remember a conversation with Mike Tomlin and Stephen A. Smith way back. It was like the early 2010s on First Take or whatever show Stephen A. Smith was doing at the time. And Stephen A. Smith, self-proclaimed Steelers fan, is like, Mike Tomlin, what are you going to do about? No, he said it was actually 2016 or 2017, excuse me, when he was like, what are you going to do about that secondary, Mike? And he was like, you used to say the same thing about my offensive lineman. You don't say that anymore, do you? And I think that's the thing, is what Mike Tomlin and his Steelers teams had done over the years was when they had a weakness, they developed it into a strength. If you remember when they won the Super Bowl in 2008, 2009, they did it with an offensive line that was not very talented, that was kind of being remade after the mid-2000s offensive line kind of aged out. Alan Faneca went to another team. Jeff Hardings, was gone. Marvell Smith was gone. They kind of had to redo everything. You had guys like Max Starks trying to hold it together. And then eventually they invested in that offensive line. And they built a really good offensive line. I even say a great offensive line. Marquise Pouncey, multi-time All-Pro, first-team All-Pro. David DeCastro, All-Pro. Ramon Foster, steady and solid right next to Pouncey. Alejandro Villanueva, solid. Marcus Gilbert, I think, who was the most underrated underrated of that group at right tackle. He was a dominant figure. They developed a group that became very solid, and that bought them time to figure out the secondary, which eventually they did when they brought in Joe Hayden, signed Steven Nelson, traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick, and they were able to have a secondary, and that carried them through the late 2019 to 2010s into the early 2020s. But the problem is in the 2020s, you saw Pouncey retire, DeCastro retire, both kind of early in within their contracts when they were hoping that they would last at least a couple more years to kind of be the leaders before that they had to reload on that group. Ramon Foster had to retire. Basically, the whole group aged out. And then the guys that were brought in after them didn't work right away. Kendrick Green was a bust of a pick. Kevin Dotson had his ups and downs. He seems to have found more of those ups in with the Los Angeles Rams. Also, almost called them St. Louis. I'm old, but when you look at what they haven't been able to do there, they've missed on their offensive line. Now, I think that they've truly made a real investment because remember, Green was a 3rd-round pick, Dotson was a 4th-round pick, and so they were trying to make do while building the offensive line while investing elsewhere in the team. But now they're making a full commitment. No, they want to be the nastiest up front, so that's why they drafted Broderick Jones in the 1st round. They drafted Troy Fautanu in the 1st round. They drafted Zach Frazier in the 2nd round. All in the last 2 drafts, the first drafts of the Omar Khan, Andy Weidel front office. They're trying to get nasty there. The problem is they haven't gotten nasty there. There was a time where it was looking like, hey, maybe they would get there, because if you go back and you look at how they were running the ball at one point this season, Najee Harris had 3 straight 100-yard performances in the middle part of the year. And there was a stretch where they rushed for over 100 yards for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 straight games, and in those games they were 7-1. They were running the ball effectively, and they were able to get things done there. So I think that was a good sign that they were able to pull that off. But at the bottom line is when you got down to the end of the season, you run against the Eagles, you get only 56 yards against them. You get 117 against the Ravens, but kind of not when it was important enough because the game kind of got out of hand late. You get 74 against the Bengals when you needed them to come through against a really bad run defense. And then you get 29 against the Ravens in the playoff game. And so disappearing at the later part of the season when the offensive line is supposed to be picking up. So then, yes, you do look at Pat Meyer and you ask yourself, well, what happened? Why hasn't Broderick Jones gotten better? And maybe you could say, hey, this team needs to move Broderick Jones to left tackle where he's always supposed to have been at Georgia. Maybe they need to do things there, but something does need change there. And that's where I think that if you're looking at criticisms for Mike Tomlin and where he needs to be stepping in, it's in those places where you're seeing the dysfunction, you're seeing the things not happen, and they didn't change there. Now, again, maybe the mystery that, I've speculated this with everyone that's come on this show, from Alan Saunders to Mike DeFable to Nick Farabaugh to Jenna Harner, everybody we bring on this show, about, hey, why is it that that Dan Moore just can't bump over to right tackle and Broderick play left tackle? And it's even been going on before Broderick Jones got drafted. Dan Moore Jr. just wouldn't move off of left tackle. So this year, now Dan Moore Jr., he's a unrestricted free agent. He can go somewhere else and figure that out, or he can be brought back for cheap. But he's not going to be a starter unless they move Broderick Jones or Troy Fautanu to guard. But and I think that's where the Steelers are looking at right now. But you need something to develop on that offensive line. That was supposed to be the unit that made things easier for the Steelers. That was supposed to be the unit that made the run game easier, but also gave better protection for Russell Wilson. Because I think one thing you saw with Russell Wilson, especially late in the season, was he became very unsure of himself and unsure of how to throw the ball and how to protect himself, because he's not the same Russell Wilson that used to be able to run a lot faster, have a lot more, quicker burst to get into his top speed, to escape pressure. He's not that guy anymore, and he needs better protection from his offensive line. If this offensive line was what it was, go back and go look at that Eagles game and look at Jalen Hurts. And granted, Jalen Hurts very mobile, but look at some of the pockets that he had and the time that he was able to just sit there, plant his feet, survey the field, and think through things. It changes how you can work. And I think that's where, when we're talking about the philosophical change needed for the team, I don't think that it's about not investing in the trenches. I don't think it's about getting stronger up there, because you do need to be stronger up there. Look at what the Eagles are doing. They're a great example. Look what the Lions are doing. They invested up front. That's a big part of the reason that they're winning right now. And yes, Jared Goff's having a good season, but it's not because Jared Goff just became Tom Brady overnight. He got put in a solid offense with a lot of talent around him. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been killing it at wide receiver. Jahmyr Gibbs is an amazing running back. And they've been able to assemble an offensive line with Ragnow and Penny Sewell and a whole bunch of guys that move people off the ball and protect their quarterback. And I think that's what the Steelers are trying to get to be. And I don't get it. I don't think it's people are saying, oh, well, they can't win with being strong up front. I think they can. They just aren't right now. And I think that's the whole point here is when you look at the Steelers offensive line, they haven't been that group for quite some time. The last time that you could say I think the Steelers offensive line was like that was maybe 2019. Maybe 2019, like 2020 last year, Pouncey into Castro. Pouncey was, clearly on his last legs. You looked at the way he was playing. That was rough. Maybe 2016, 2017, because you remember the 2016 season. The last time this Steelers team won a playoff game was when they ran for over 200 yards, and they still needed to win with 6 field goals because they couldn't finish a drive through the air. But that was where I think that's where the Steelers are trying to get themselves to, is assembling this offensive line and growing it. And if Pat Meyer isn't getting the results that you want from Broderick Jones, and he's not getting, that's a first round pick that you're expecting to get a lot more out of, and you need to see a lot more out of this upcoming season in what's going to be his third year. And you're not seeing enough from guys from Zach Frazier, and you're seeing other guys fall off like Dan Moore. Maybe you do need to change that up, and maybe you do need something to switch there. Now, as a person who covers the team, I can't tell you, what Pat Meyer does that's different as far as the O-line coach. You go back to, everyone will go back to Mike Munchak and what he did for that group. But Mike Munchak, had 2 first-round picks in Pouncey and DeCastro, who turned into all pros. And sometimes, you can be a really great position coach, or you can be a mediocre position coach, but some people don't know the difference between them, because sometimes it's just about the talent that you have that you're coaching. And you're saying, hey, those are my guys. And they just happen to be some really good dudes. And again, Marcus Gilbert, a 2nd-round pick. And so when you had those anchors on your offensive line, it made it to the undrafted guys like Ramon Foster could come in and be good players, but not have to be the guys that set the tone for everybody else. And so that's what the Steelers offensive line is at now. I think they need to they need their anchors available to them. They need these guys to develop into anchors. They need Trautano to be that next year. They need to be healthy next year. They need Zach Frazier to be healthy and become one of those anchors next year. And they also need Broderick Jones to grow, because there was certain times on top of, technique mistakes, times that he looked lost in the sauce as well. I think everyone's seen the clip floating around on one of the run plays that the Steelers got blown up on in this game, where Dan Moore Jr. and Broderick Jones both pulled at the same time and basically crossed each other up, and the whole play blows up because they're going in someone shouldn't have been pulling there. And just looking at the design of the play, I think it was Broderick Jones who was wrong on that one. And so you need an offensive line coach that can get through to them. That's one of those things that needs to happen there. And so if you're looking at changes, my top 2 culprits are that I think the Steelers could see themselves doing is Teryl Austin and Pat Meyer. And again, there could be others, but if the Steelers aren't moving on from Mike Tomlin, they're not gutting the whole staff. They're not getting rid of everybody. And the Rooneys don't typically just get rid of everybody, but they do admit that when there's change. And I think that's what we're going to need to see is what's Art Rooney's statement at the end of this year. Normally he gives one, and normally there's a big talk about what the Steelers, need to do and where the Steelers are, sort of his state of the union of the Steelers at the end of the season. We'll see where he's at on that. And I think that'll be interesting to see, what does he say that they need to do? Because if you remember, at the end, I think it was 2021. No, 2020. Yeah, I think it was 2020 when they finished that season, or no, 2019. Excuse me, I'm mixing up all my years. When they were like, hey, this finishing last in the rushing offense needs to stop. And I think it actually was 2020 that happened or something like that. But this team needs to be able to run the football. And so they went and got Najee Harris, and they started to develop the offensive line. And that's something they've been working on for a bit. I think that they still want to get to that, but I want to see what does Art Rooney say that, hey, they need to get back to, and in him explaining, hey, this is why we still believe in Mike Tomlin, because, I think that, again, when you look at Mike Tomlin, I'm not putting much on Mike Tomlin for losing to the Bills with Mason Rudolph and no TJ Watt when you're playing Josh Allen. That's it, Josh Allen in his house. Everyone, I saw people, starting to praise, oh, look at Sean Payton, he's a genius. Look, they're up early on the Bills, and then they lost by 24 to the Bills. More points to the Bills than the Steelers lost to the Ravens. So I think that there's certain things that, hey, like, I'm not putting that loss on Sean Payton. He had a rookie quarterback there. He's rebuilding with a new team. There's a lot going on there. Just like I'm not putting the Bills' loss on schemes against the Bills. I think that they're just outmatched there, and that's not what I'm going to do. Same thing kind of with the Chiefs, where the defense had the scheme early on, but ultimately, eventually, the offense never delivered because you had old man Ben Roethlisberger, and then eventually Patrick Mahomes and what was the best offense maybe we've seen in the NFL, right up there with the 2007 Patriots. They eventually figured you out and they got through on you. But at the same time, that's not what happened in this game around. And so that's where I think Art Rooney has to address things, is that, hey, this is the first time ever the Steelers have ended on like a 5-game losing streak to end the season. I think the most games that they had ever lost going into the season under Mike Tomlin to end the year was their 3-game losing streak that ended the 2019 season when they had Devlin Hodges down the stretch. And I might be wrong. There might be one year that I'm forgetting there off the top of my head. But bottom line is, normally, even like last year when the Steelers lost 3 straight and they fell to 7-7, they won 3 straight and they got to 10-7 to make the playoffs. So like you've seen these teams, Mike Tomlin's teams, rebound after tough stretches. They didn't do that this year. There was no rebound, and I think that's where Art Rooney has to talk about, if there's going to be a reason for keeping Mike Tomlin. What is the rebound? Is that what's the confidence that he's going to bring the rebound next year? We'll keep talking about that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We will try to do our grades tomorrow with Alan Saunders. We'll see how that goes. I still have a lot of other things I need to get done personally, for work, but we're going to try to put our grade segment together. We're also going to try to talk about Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, and what the quarterback situation needs to be, because that's another major decision. And that's the thing about the Steelers team. There are many crossroads to figure out. We'll keep talking about them here every day on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, all the places at my handle, Carter Critiques. You can read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette by going to post-gazette.com. You can find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, breaking down your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. See you tomorrow here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.